make sure they can come on. You are live.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and joining us today for this Annapolis Small Maritime Business Work Group. My name is Stephen Rice. I'm the Economic Development Manager for the City of Annapolis, and I guess I'll be the principal facilitator today. And we can go around the horn and everyone can introduce themselves in no particular order. Actually, I will start with Mr. Jakubiak, and we'll do the city staff and then everyone else.
Good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Jakubiak. I'm the Director of Planning and Zoning, and happy to be here and happy to implement this requirement of the City Council that the Director establish a small working group to understand the impacts of this legislation on small maritime operators. So glad to be here, and I'll be here throughout.
Thank you, Chris. Hope.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hope Stewart. I've emailed with you all. I'm in the Economic Development Office. And in case anybody is wondering why we are on YouTube or why we're recording this, it's because this was mandated by City Council. And as such, we have to have the meeting is open to the public and public viewing. So just wanted to make you aware of that. And thank you, everybody, for your participation. I will be going off video because I will be taking minutes during this meeting.
Thank you. Eric.
Hey everyone, Eric Lashinsky. I'm a Chief of Comprehensive Planning in the Department of Planning and Zoning. I'm here primarily because I was involved with the Maritime Task Force, the one person in our department who was pretty involved, and I guess as familiar as anyone with the city's code as it pertains to the maritime districts, and just look forward to meeting you all and having a conversation about this.
Mr. Tomasini.
Thanks, Stephen. Mike Tomasini. I own Pirate Adventures on the Chesapeake, small maritime business here in the city. I am here because as Vice Chair of the Maritime Advisory Board for the City of Annapolis, I was asked to act as the liaison between this group and that board.
Mr. Owen.
Hello, Sean Owen. I'm the owner of Chronic Sailing. We're a small charter company based out of Port Annapolis, Marino, and Back Creek. Hope just reached out to me asking if I would be a part of this just as a new business here on Annapolis waters.
Thank you. Mr. Lerner.
Yeah, hi, I'm Seth, and I have a residence in Eastport, and I also own Horn Point Harbor on Eastern Avenue.
Captain K.
Oops, you're on mute.
Guys, I'm Captain Jen. Me and my family run the schooner Woodwind and Woodwind 2 from the Annapolis Waterfront Hotel.
Thank you all. And I guess whoever else joins us, we'll make sure that they get introduced as well. So the purpose of this working group is to discuss the impact of O2521 on small maritime operations. And if there are any recommendations, I guess, for updates or changes to make those to the Maritime Advisory Board for the city and to the City Council Rules Committee. And just as a little bit of background for those who may know or who may or may not remember, the city created a maritime task force back in, I believe it was 2020, and they met in 2020 into 2021 and to come up with recommendations for the city's maritime zones. And the task force produced it was about a 50-page report, as I recall, and that served as the basis for the legislation O2521, which did in fact update the code and the maritime districts in particular. Now, our resident expert is Mr. Eric Lashinsky, who's the Chief of Comprehensive Planning, and he's going to give us an overview of O2521 before we start the more formal discussion.
All right, thank you, Steve. So, yes, Steve was right. The Maritime Task Force was convened in 2020. It ran for a bit over a year. It had a pretty broad cross-section of folks participating, maritime business owners, property owners in the maritime districts, residents in neighboring areas, some institutions within the maritime districts, such as the Maritime Museum, National Park Service was involved. And the primary goal was to strengthen our maritime industry in the city. Basically, understand the things that make Annapolis unique from a maritime economy perspective. What do we need to protect? What do we need to enhance, expand? How can we reinforce Annapolis as a competitive place within that marketplace? And that was the primary task. There was a city council resolution that created the task force, and primarily the timing of it was because we're 30 years out, 35 years out from when these maritime zoning districts were originally created in the mid 80s. A lot had changed. Some of the properties were seeing changes in the marketplace, and there was a consensus that we needed to look. This was as good a time as any to look at the zoning districts, how they function, and whether they need to be updated. And so the task force was convened to do that. And we met over many meetings. There were subcommittees as part of that. And the primary outcome was both the report that Steve mentioned. We have lots of printed copies of it. I think everybody who participates on this working group should get one of these, and we can send the link out. The digital copy is on the city's website. But I think more importantly, there was a zoning update, an ordinance that came out of the task force recommendations that the city council adopted, again, after many meetings, deliberations. And the primary outcome, I would say, from that zoning update was basically additional flexibility for non-maritime uses to some, not all, of the properties in the maritime districts. And there was I would say, a hard-fought compromise. There were many challenging meetings that were part of this task force. And really, I think there were some third rail issues that were, things like residential uses in the maritime districts was a third rail, and very little appetite for additional residential use in the maritime districts. One example, the compromise that was forged was, well, what are the services that are critical to the maritime industry in the city, that if we lose those, we don't have the economy, we're not able to support the economy that we do today. And those were what we call triggers. Those were the things that could activate additional flexibility. If they were preserved, a property could gain additional non-maritime allowances. And so it were 5 basic triggers. And I believe it was 25,000 square foot of boatyard space, working boatyard space. It was a 40-ton travel lift. It was a fuel dock, fire boat, slip space, and I'm forgetting, I think it was the boat storage. I forget the exact number for the boat storage. But the basic consensus was, if you have one of those things, you're a critical asset to the economy. And if you could preserve that, you were granted additional non-maritime allowance. And that was, coming to that determination was very challenging. But that was the consensus opinion ultimately. And we kind of went a step further and said, and I know that Hope had sent out the website and the fact sheet that has the exact non-maritime allowances that came with the zoning. So I won't necessarily go through that, but we can look at that closer if we need to. But the next step that came out of this was actually not related to the maritime industry. It was related to public water access, which wasn't really a core intent of this task force, but inevitably became a hot topic because it's a pretty significant citywide issue. There's a lot of waterfront in our maritime districts. There was a feeling that some of that waterfront could be better utilized in kind of a shared way and not necessarily diminish uses of maritime uses on the waterfront. And so something called water access incentives was a concept was created by the task force or recommended by the task force. And what that did was create a framework of different types of water access amenities that properties could provide. And if they provided those, they were granted additional non-maritime use. And it's fairly modest, 5 to 10% additional gross floor square footage could be dedicated to non-maritime uses if you fulfilled the requirements of these water access incentives. So that was essentially what came out of the zoning update. And there were a few other things that were not zoning related. The Annapolis Maritime Industry Fund, some of you may be aware of, was created, and we subsequently learned that there was already an industry fund that had been proposed many years ago, and recent legislation corrected it, brought it up to date, and that fund is now active, and it is funded by fees that come from the non-maritime usage that is allowed by these water access incentives. It's not a huge amount. I think that there should be other mechanisms for feeding that fund for it to actually be functional, but that's what came out of the ordinance that was passed by the city council. And then, of course, some of these reporting requirements for how much maritime and non-maritime use is in the city, and that's something that Steve and Hope have been working on. And then this working group that revisiting how the zoning updates or the ordinance in total has really impacted small businesses in the city. So that's the rundown, but I know there's lots of details that we can get into.
So thank you, Eric. Just to recap, and this is in the materials that Hope sent out a little while ago, but prior to the enactment of 02521, in WMM, you were allowed 30% non-maritime, in WMI 0%, and WME 0%. And then after the enactment of 02521, there were certain triggers that would allow an increase maritime percentage. And those triggers are a 20,000 square foot working yard, or a 25,000 square foot on-land boat storage, or seafood processing, or a boat or sailing club. So those were triggers that would enable you to have in WMM 45% non-maritime percentage, in WMI 15%, and in WME 15%. So essentially a baseline 15% increase in non-maritime percentage in each of those maritime zones. And then if you were to take advantage of the water access incentives that Eric just went through, you can increase your non-maritime percentage up to 55% in WMM, and 20% in WMI, and 20% in WME. And those water access incentives, just once again, the first category, which would allow a 5% increase, are a water taxi landing, public water access, recreational water access, or a crabbing or fishing facility. Category 2, which would enable you to go up 10%, is 150 on-site parking spaces, $200,000 in a payment for a street and park, or having a community boating facility. So that's essentially what came out of 02521, which has brought us here today. Anything else, Eric?
I'll just say, I mean, if these sound complex, they are. I would say, this is the particular way that was structured to privilege maritime use over non-maritime use, and that's really the driving intent here.
And actually, before we move forward, we had one other member join us. Mr. Copeland, could you introduce yourself?
Hi all, my name is Ryan Copeland. I'm the general counsel of Acme Marina Company. We own and operate the Annapolis Landing Marina on AWOL, and happy to be here.
Thank you. So since 02521 has been in operation for a couple of years now, and given the purpose of this group, my question for the group is essentially, how have you been impacted by these zoning changes, if at all, over the past few years? And we're looking for positive, negative, any challenges, any opportunities that you see. And obviously for the newer members of this community, this wouldn't necessarily pertain to you, but we still welcome your insight and any feedback.
Should we also see if anybody has any questions about the ordinance? Because it is quite complex, and I think we're probably throwing a lot out of people. So
that's a great suggestion, Hope. So we'll start with questions for Mr. Lashinsky. No technical questions.
or we'll just give you all time to reread the ordinance.
Actually, I have a technical question for Mr. Lashinsky, or really, frankly, anyone at the city. Do you have a reference to when these zoning designations were actually created by the city? What the dating of that is?
See, I think it was 1987.
Okay, so prior to 1987, what were these parcels designated as?
That I would need to get back to you. I think there was a sort of a I think we may have had two maritime zones. I think it got a little bit more specific in 1987, but I'd have to look into it. I don't know offhand what they were.
Okay. I mean, I assume we have to, I'm sorry, just going to follow up, is that I'm looking in the background, I'm looking at Hope was nice enough to send out that link that shows the designated zonings throughout the city, so that it's clearly WME, WMM, et cetera. In Eastport alone, I think it's just those two, WME, WMM. So I'm assuming that those were designated business related, although maybe I shouldn't, because there's a lot of residential use in there prior to 1987, right?
You know, the basic impetus was there was understand it, there was tremendous development pressure on the waterfront in the mid 80s, primarily from residential and tourism industry, hotels, condos, et cetera. And that was what really drove the creation of the maritime districts that we know today.
It's August 24th, 1987 is the enactment, the first go around.
And then those designated zonings have been in place through today. I don't know of anybody who's been rezoned to a different category since 1987. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's accurate, right?
Yeah, I would need to get back. I don't know offhand. We we don't create new zones very often. Just I'll put that out there. I mean, the the city code is pretty stringent when it comes to creating new zones for the zoning ordinance. And moving properties from one zone to another is also a very stringent process.
Okay, that was my technical question.
Steve, may I ask a question for Eric? Eric, can you just take us through, for the benefit of everybody, what are the typical standard non-maritime and maritime uses? Because ultimately this is about the split. So let's really get into what is not maritime and therefore what is essentially discouraged by these provisions in the zoning code. And or the other way of looking at it, what types of uses you could add onto the waterfront if you achieve these triggers and incentives.
Sure, I'll try to answer that. So generally, we split the non-maritime uses into uses that are compatible with maritime uses and uses that are less compatible or not compatible at all. And generally, the ones that are not compatible are the residential, the restaurants are frequently considered, not compatible just because of their side needs, just the servicing of the business, and can overwhelm a property very quickly, parking requirements, etc. There's a real wide range of uses that I would say are compatible, though. I mean, range of office uses, fitness, retail merchandise, rental type, recreational rentals for tourism or what have you. Kind of, I mean, I would say there's a growing list of uses that may have not existed, 35 years ago when these zones were created. People weren't doing yoga on the piers, for example, or they're maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe they were, but no, I mean, just the way people live has changed, and the way they use the waterfront and the kind of activities that happen that could be seen as compatible with maritime uses. When I say maritime uses, I mean, that also is a broad spectrum that, if you look at the city code, I mean, it includes a wide range of things that aren't necessarily hard maritime. When I say that, I mean boatyard activities. But we, as a city, need to retain the hard maritime. I mean, I should have said that in my intro remarks, but the hard maritime is really was the aspect of maritime uses that was seen as most critical to preserving the economy here when we were convening the task force. And the effort to prevent that from going away was really one of the core discussions. So, we're looking for non-maritime uses primarily that won't compete with or be incompatible with hard maritime in most cases.
I'm sorry, when Eric says hard maritime, he's talking about boat repair and boat services. And again, he did mention trades.
Right.
And the economic, just I'm gonna step aside just a little bit, and since Eric touched on the economic component, one of the things that the task force brought to light was the fact that Annapolis, given our maritime cluster, is a pretty important East Coast seaport. for lack of a better term, for boating, for yachting, for recreation, on the recreational boating and yachting scene. And Annapolis has one of the few places on the East Coast where you can pretty much sail or boat or drive your yacht or boat in and get almost anything done from a repair, maintenance, and a services standpoint. And so that's an important characteristic about the city. And we have a maritime cluster that we would like to maintain so that we can maintain that prominence and that position, because not only is it good for boaters and sailors and so forth, but it's very good for our economy. So doing what we can to maintain this critical infrastructure when it comes to our maritime cluster is something that is at the forefront from a policy standpoint, because we want to. There are other jurisdictions up and down the East Coast that would love to slide into our position and to build a maritime business services, trades, repair cluster of their own, and essentially steal market share. And we don't want that obviously to happen. And so we need to do what we can to ensure that that doesn't happen. So that was one of the takeaways from the Maritime Task Force as well, if that's helpful. And I guess did you have anything else, Eric?
No, not right now.
So getting back to the I guess my initial question, now that 02521 has been in existence for a couple of years, how have your businesses, if at all, been impacted by these zoning changes? Is there any feedback, any insight?
I think
Has
it's
it
going
had
to
any impact at all?
this part of it would probably be hard, Stephen, just because of the timing of the enactment of the legislation, right? Because anything that floated during 2020 and 2021 was getting bought, resold for a higher price than you bought it for. I mean, people were getting into the marine ecosystem by the dozens, because that was pretty much all you could do. Your kids couldn't play soccer. Nobody was going to school. So, people were buying boats and paddlecraft and all this kind of stuff. So I think the dust is kind of settling on it now. I don't think that, as a result of the legislation, much has changed for me. I've been in business for 20 plus years, and I've been in my space for 20 plus years. I am seeing there is a lot of activity maritime wise. And I think that, there's been a lot of fall off on professional office. I'm sure Seth can speak to that, right? Professional office space is not in demand like it was in 2019 or even the early parts of 2020. So, for me, and I was part of the task force, I think it's going to be difficult to really judge it, just because of what has happened and is now, slowly leveling out as a result of COVID-19.
So, Mike, if you can't say yet how it has impacted you, do you have any thoughts of how it might impact you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that not necessarily me specifically, but I think where the trades people thought during the task force was that once a space becomes a non-maritime space, once let's say a rigger shop becomes an office space, a professional office space, it's not going to go back to being a rigger shop, or once a small maritime office space that was good for a broker becomes a larger office space filled with 25 plus cubicles, then that space is never going to go back to a small time broker or somebody like that. So from the trades perspective, that's what we were hearing during the thing. And to Eric's point, there were a couple of real hot items that nobody really wanted to touch. One of them being residential. If any one of these spaces in the WMM specifically became high-end residential or condo developments, then the noise from the boatyards and the things like that come with being a maritime city and an industry hub was going to go away, because in the end, if residents start to get upset about the noise or the dust or the activity from a neighboring property, that's when, you know, those types of businesses start to feel the pinch.
Yeah, I'll jump in and follow Mike if that's okay with everybody. So Eric, I did hear you clearly that you took into consideration, or the panel or the group, the previous groups and the legislators took into consideration that things change over time, which is reality. I think we all agree on that. What's left in here, though, is things that have most definitely changed that will not come back. So, for example, a seafood processing. You know, let's, how about we call it what it is for a moment? That was created because of McNasby's oysters that processed seafood for many, many years. Fantastic. We all love that. It's now a museum owned by the city. The property is owned by the city. And what's all of the zones that were created in 1987 now are held to a standard that was most definitely started in 1987. And I don't see any of those stricken. So that seafood processing notation is a great example. I'm not sure I know the definition of seafood processing, but I do know that it will never, I mean, how would that ever come back in significance to all of Eastport under really quite literally any circumstance? I don't see the city putting money at turning McNasby's back into a seafood processing building, and that would be a direct benefit to the city, right? So I'm not clear on why those sorts of things remain in the legislation today. To be a little bit elaborate even a little bit further, when you take the bulk of the WME properties, they are substantially small in parcel size and lot size, smaller than the WMI. We know that. Can't argue with math. And they're mostly smaller than the WMMs. But we all offer very common services. So, for example, if Jen K wanted to harbor her or dock her boat, or boats rather, at any of these marinas at any time, we could all provide the exact same service in water storage. Now, there are things we can't provide that separate us. So, for example, at my property, we do not haul boats. There's no out of land hauling at the marina. Jabin's does, right? So there's a difference. But we can't change the on-land boat storage. In other words, I can't change the size of my parcel. So what that's doing is immediately, now that we have this new legislation that was brought into effect just 20 months ago or something, we've already reinforced that, number one, there are properties that are going to be very limited in scope because of their size and because of what they can actually offer as a result of their size. And furthermore, the city is not striking anything that's historic. Okay. So I think what's happening, to answer your, that's a very long way to get to your question, to answer your question, Hope, is that the bulk of the WME properties, we don't really, I mean, reality sets in and you can't really see much, this really doing much benefit to bring in a new boat manufacturer, a new seafood I mean, I just don't know. I don't know how a property owner and a stakeholder and a manager, et cetera, are going to realistically get some really big or even medium-sized maritime use out of that piece of this puzzle. So what are we left with? Well, we're left with trying to find reasonably decent office use, which is of course addressed. And then also dealing with things like perhaps restaurant use, perhaps deli use, services that all of the customers like and want, most of the residents like and want. But again, we have to now play under some new quasi incentives, but certainly new rules in order to get those. And to be frank, they're expensive. I mean, you have to have a really hell of an idea to come up with $200,000 to increase the gross sized footage access by a whopping 5%. I mean, I can't even come up with an example of how a property owner or manager puts down 200 grand to increase use of 5%. And I don't even, not that I can certainly do the math on that for our next meeting, but my God, that's one hell of a stiff nut, okay, to put out there. So again, I guess my thought on this is that the first thing is that we, as a group, really should be looking at, or I would propose that we look at, is striking the stuff that just is no longer relevant. In 1987, McNasby's was processing seafood. I'm sure of it. I don't think we have to go further than that example.
So would that be an assignment to give the group then to take a look at the uses? So would you like me to send out the use table and people can kind of take a look at the different uses and see what their recommendations would be for what might be historic now?
I would be happy to do that.
I mean, just as one consideration for the group.
Seth, if you could spearhead that and come up with some recommendations, I think that would be helpful.
There you go. I'd be happy to, and again, I don't mean to belabor a point, but I think that I'm hoping even that Eric, you'd agree that when we look at going forward, to have something hang in the balance of the possibility of success, and have that thing be something that's just so far in the rear mirror. I don't see why we would be subject to that. Now, I don't know the technicalities of the legislation where this team can quite literally go to the city council and make suggestions of how things get changed. I don't know the thoughts on that, but I'd be more than happy to help with that.
And Seth, also just for context, Eric did mention compromise, and he's absolutely right. With the Maritime Task Force a few years back, there were some who did not want any changes to the maritime zones, and were afraid that any changes to the maritime zones would essentially, I'll just say, let the genie out of the bottle, and then we'll go from protecting maritime, actively with zoning to allowing more and more and more and more and more non-maritime. So the triggers were intentionally set at a high bar to prevent an overabundance of potentially non-maritime uses taking over the maritime districts and taking over for Eastport. And so that's just some context with regard to how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, Steve, and I'll follow up and then I'll stop. But I fully understand that, and I get that, and I'm clear on the recent past and the further past. When you look at this from a slightly different paradigm shift, where all of us, I can't recall if I've met Ryan in person or not, but he runs a marina directly across the creek from me, right? He and I, in many respects, offer the exact same services, identical. We can store your boat, we can provide you with parking, the list goes on, right? So that's pretty clear what a maritime use is. Now, under what scenario should one property be subject to a really substantially high trigger, to use that keyword, and another should not? when we're essentially offering the same services and goods, et cetera, for the city of Annapolis. And, you know, Stephen, a couple of years ago, when this was brought to the forefront and then enacted as legislation, man, it was very obvious. It's right here. It's obvious right now. WMI non-merit 001520, and then you have our immediate competition going 30 and then 45 and 55. Well, that's a pretty big imbalance, right? And so that's where it got us here. So I do appreciate that, but I think one of the elements is, again, looking at how did this begin? I think we all agree 1987. Where did it bring us to 2 years ago? And how can we immediately justify some things that are, as a result of this, are absolutely imbalanced?
Ryan, you were name dropped. Any follow up?
No, I agree. And generally anything that we can, do to get more flexibility. For instance, we have a ship store that's essentially on the water, and due to these relatively arcane restrictions, we can't sell beer and wine there because the regulation says you can't sell beer or wine on a parcel that abuts the waterway. So I think anything that we can do to ultimately expand the use case for all of us would be really helpful.
Thank you. Sean, Captain Jen, any thoughts?
Stephen, it might also be helpful as an assignment to identify, just like Seth said, there are things that are probably never coming back, especially not on some of these smaller parcels. It might also be good to identify what other uses have, the use table in general is not something I don't think we really took a very hard look at during the task force, but there may be new uses that should be considered maritime or, supportive of the maritime that, are potentially out there.
So Mike, are you saying expanding the definition for maritime? Is that where you're going, or you're saying
just going down to the table of uses and just right? So it's got, in-water boat storage, on-land boat storage, boat repair and maintenance. I mean, all these are pretty much blocking and tackling. But like Eric said, a yoga studio that does yoga on a floating dock or on paddle boards outside of, that's not necessarily in here, right? Or, we've got, tugboat towing services. There may be other uses that just aren't in here.
Yeah, I think one that had come up before was offshore wind farms. That definitely was around back then, but if you're servicing an offshore wind farm, then you're definitely contributing to the maritime industry.
I'll jump in again. I can't help myself. There's a whole new generation of stuff that's come to the forefront that's maritime related, right? So I think that, Mike, you're right on target, where we could certainly generate an updated list of applications that would be appropriate for sure.
Yep.
so? I definitely I think that would be value added for sure, and that really leads into the next question, which is, are there specific zoning changes that, if they were implemented, and we've kind of moved in this direction already, if there are specific changes that, if they were implemented, that would help your businesses flourish or help your businesses thrive, or that are impediments, what exactly are those, and what would you suggest we change? Because of the impact of 025-21, of course, in the backdrop. And it's to Seth's viewpoint, and I'll say Ryan and some others, the limitations of that legislation.
And we don't necessarily have to answer these questions tonight. These are questions for us to consider as well for the next meeting. So don't feel like you need to have an answer right now.
But if there's anything top of mind that would be helpful,
Yes.
please feel free to share.
Yeah, definitely.
That's our mission.
May I ask a question that I guess I'm curious why how I can benefit and into this group because I would love to be beneficial in this, but I'm not a property owner and there's not that much that can be done over there at the hotel and I just have 2 boats and where I want to be helpful is if I can be, but I also don't want to take up space in this group if I can't be helpful.
Well, you are helpful for a number of reasons because you're a small maritime operator, and this group is for that. You're also in WMC, and we want to make sure that we have geographic diversity across the maritime zones. And even if you don't have a whole lot to say today, I know you well enough that you might have a lot to say the next meeting or the one after that. So thank you for your participation. We're happy to have you.
Okay.
And Jennifer, the other consideration too is going into the future, how might things look for you, one day? Maybe you might expand to another area, another marina, another district. So, we want to be forward thinking as well.
Got it. Thank you.
And if I might add, Jen, Captain, your business speaks to or is part of the list of uses that may not have existed 20 years ago, that still may make up a viable maritime industry in the future. So when we talk about the zoning restrictions that do impose burdens on the property owners, we also think about whether those burdens essentially support businesses like you who may not be there if the property owner transitioned out of a strong maritime type of operation. So it's about ensuring capacity within the maritime industry for the evolution of maritime businesses and sustaining those that exist now. So I would think about your own business and those like yours and it's their viability in the context of this zoning framework that's been set in place, which is really about protecting the maritime industry generally. And that's what the shared goal is here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I'll jump in on behalf of, and Ryan, I guarantee will support this, Jen. You're as the property owner, we actually need partners in business. Okay. And it's critical that we have successful partners. So your business is perfect because you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of visitors passing through that hotel. Every third one of them stops and buys an alcoholic beverage or a plate of fries or whatever. So it's very important that your success is rather critical. I mean, I got to tell you, I'd love to have your business in my place. I guarantee you Ryan would too. So it's hand in hand, and I think that needs to be underlined right back in this legislation because, guys, we need to be able to get Jen and a lot of successful Gens for all of these properties.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Seth.
Yeah, I mean, are you saying that being a sailing vessel that takes people out sailing, gets them out on the water, that wouldn't be part of what would be accepted as a waterfront business?
I don't think anybody's saying that. No. Yeah. No, I think quite the opposite.
Okay.
Seth did say the word critical, and I think that's important. I did want to mention there is a critical mass of maritime businesses that essentially the city needs to have in order for us as a city and as an industry to have this maritime cluster that essentially allows us to be a one-stop shop on the East Coast. And if we lose businesses, and if we lose a certain number of businesses, then we won't be able to have that to perform those same services and to have that same prominence and preeminence. So we have to maintain our critical mass baseline, and we also have to grow our industry into the future. So, Sean, you've been very quiet.
Yeah, I'm just new to the game, the town up here, so just kind of keeping my eye and paying attention with you guys more than I have much to contribute yet. I'm not sure if this is in the scope, but just in walking around our marina in general with the ordinance change in general, there seems to be a lot of worry about the liveaboard verbiage and some of the changes and how that affects with short-term rentals. So I don't know if that's in the scope of what we're trying to go through here, but I know that is a concern that's been voiced at least here at Port A, and then from a couple people just at adjacent marinas as well.
I know that there's some actually I know that the city is looking at that issue pretty diligently. I don't know, Chris, you might have more perspective on that.
Yeah, so there's been a proposal for an ordinance that would allow or treat not liveaboards, but houseboats as a viable use, a viable economic activity within marinas. But that legislation has been pulled and it's been rewritten, and it's not yet even made part of this discussion, certainly. And it'll have its own task force and public involvement effort, and it'll involve the maritime community and the general public, like any ordinance would. But here we're really going to stay focused on this bill, this legislation, this maritime legislation as it is now. Although we got to be cognizant of what is swirling around these discussions, of course. But we're going to really stay focused on the zoning aspects of 02521.
That's kind of what I figured.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sean, I
I'm
just
sorry,
wanted, I just want to jump in real quick, Sean, about why your perspective is valuable as a brand new business and as a maritime business that we want to keep attracting to the city, about what it is in the city and what we need to preserve and what we need to keep to bring businesses like yours in. Sorry, Seth, you can go ahead.
So the obvious question then is maybe you don't have to answer now, but to think about what attracted you to the specific location you're in now. What was your site selection like? Why did you land where you did? And what would that be? How would that be enhanced or made more difficult by legislation like that exists now in the city? You may have not known that, but there were certain rules and limitations that might have guided you to the decision you made. And through this process, I think those will become more clear.
Okay.
We want your feedback on that, your understanding of that, and how that might affect your possible expansion, or how it might affect other people who are similarly situated. Because we want you here. And so we want to understand what brought you here and what we need to do to keep you here.
And I need to jump in real quick because, as Seth and Madeline both know, Port Wardens is coming up at 6:30. So I think we need to wrap up now. But I will send out kind of the follow-up questions for you all to consider. Seth, I'll send out the use permit table and yeah, anything else, Steve, before we wrap up?
Yeah, real quick, Seth, I think there was one more thing you wanted to opine on before we wrapped up. People were talking over each other.
No, I'm good. I'm good. I was just, I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I'll just take the initiative to say thank you to everyone who participated today. Our next meeting is on October 15th. And we will wrap up. Hope will provide some information afterwards. And I know that this is a little challenging, and I know that the legislation is really long. But we do value and we do want your insight and perspective to the best of your ability. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, everyone.